Hello ladies and gentlemen, Top Hat Gaming Man here, a gentleman with an appreciation for gaming history who happens to be a boomer stuck in a millennial's body. Speaking of millennials, particularly the younger ones who were born nearly a decade after me, they seem to really bloody love the GameCube for some reason, and as a result cherish the contributions it made to their childhoods. For many older, more experienced gamers though, the GameCube fails to hold the same level of significance or nostalgia for us, as it was probably the least intriguing home console Nintendo have released to this date. So, if you are about 10 years younger than me and happen to be watching today, prepare to have those rose-tinted glasses slapped off of your inexperienced faces, as this is the story of why the Nintendo GameCube failed. Yeah. Before we get into the full swing of things, I just thought I needed to start off by clarifying a few things, as GameCube fanboys can often be some of the most annoying people on the internet, so I thought it would be best to define what failure actually is on this occasion. The dictionary gives us two meanings for this word, including a lack of success or the neglect or omission of expected or required action. If we have a look at the life cycle of the GameCube, it is extremely easy to put the GameCube within the failure box, as the system failed to reach the level of success Nintendo wanted to achieve at the beginning of a console generation. Further to this, success and failure are both relative, and we can deem the platform as a failure as a result of not living up to Nintendo's sales expectations. In fact, in terms of home consoles, Nintendo's level of success was continuing to diminish every generation, with the GameCube being the third consecutive system that sold significantly worse than its predecessor. To illustrate this, let us take a quick look at these sales. We had the NES, which sold 62 million units. However, the following generation, the Super Nintendo, would sell 49 million units. By the time they got to the Nintendo 64, sales were down to 32 million units, meaning Nintendo had lost half of their popularity since the NES days. Finally, we get to the GameCube, which sold an embarrassing amount of units for Nintendo, with only 21 million, which meant over the course of years, 2/3 of Nintendo's fanbase had completely abandoned their home consoles. So with this in mind, let us try and explore what had gone so wrong for the company over the years, which resulted in the Big N finishing in third place that console generation. Was it simply a case of the level of competition being too high for them to compete with, or was it more of a case of Nintendo themselves simply making silly mistakes? I will try to explore this subject the best for you I can. I think probably the first thing we need to look into regarding the failings of the GameCube is probably the platform's predecessor, the Nintendo 64. The Nintendo 64 was a strange console looking back. It featured some of the most innovative, state-of-the-art and beloved games of all time, such as Mario 64, Ocarina of Time and Goldeneye. The system certainly left its mark, but due to a number of factors, it always trailed behind the Sony PlayStation and was less appealing as a result. The PlayStation library, in comparison, was absolutely huge and featured swaths of high-quality games, offering great experiences to fans of every gaming genre imaginable. The cheap-to-produce CD-ROM media, paired with the huge install base of PlayStation owners, made the system a wet dream for third-party publishers. The PlayStation's attraction contrasted the Nintendo 64's biggest weakness, the dated, expensive cartridge-based media the games were contained on. If a third party wanted to make a Nintendo game, they would not only first have to fork up the huge cost to buy these cartridges from Nintendo, but they would also have to give Nintendo a much larger cut of their profits on sales than what Sony were asking for with the PlayStation. So all in all, it was a win-win for third parties to support the PlayStation instead. The expensive, dated cartridge format was chosen for the Nintendo 64, apparently due to the company's high fears of losing some of their profits through piracy. However, in this instance, it looked like the greedy company chose to cut off their nose to spite the face, as the pricey cartridges with low storage space simply pushed publishers away. The lack of games resulted in the platform becoming a rather polarising console, with many consumers, including myself, opting to buy a Sony PlayStation after their 64 purchase simply so they had more choice when it came to games. Despite this though, this system still had its fair share of diehards who were more than happy with the iconic first-party titles Nintendo would trickle out here and there. Now you are probably thinking, why are we talking so much about the failings of the Nintendo 64 if this is meant to be a GameCube video? Well, the answer to this question is simple. The earliest failings of the GameCube is the Nintendo 64 itself, as the system can be blamed for shrinking Nintendo's market share and putting off a large range of consumers from wanting to invest in a second place under-supported games console once again. When we take into account that the PlayStation outclassed the 64, this meant the majority of gamers who experienced the generation were eager to become PlayStation 2 owners upon the system's release. The PlayStation 2 was instantly an in-demand machine as soon as it hit the shelves. PlayStation's popularity, paired with the fact that the system could play bloody DVDs, made the console a hit product, which was even further reinforced by the fact that it was backwards compatible, meaning that buyers could continue to use their old library of games on the device. This would lead to the platform becoming the best-selling games console of all time. So holding these thoughts, it was very clear before the GameCube even existed that Nintendo would have a huge battle on their hands if they were even to grab a market share. So there you have 2 points covered which contributed to the GameCube's sales failings. The PlayStation 2's insta success and the Nintendo 64's lack of third-party support resulted in Nintendo losing a chunk of their fan base to Sony. Speaking of the Nintendo 64 and its iconic top-tier games, the hope of receiving sequels to these games on the GameCube would be a key reason as to why many people would be watching and waiting to pick one of these machines up when the time was right. Now, simply speaking from a perspective of my own personal opinion and experiences, I do not feel that Nintendo adequately followed up on the GameCube with any of their biggest hits from the previous generation. Let's quickly talk through a few of these so you can grasp what I am talking about. The game that changed the world of the Nintendo 64 on release was Mario 64, the innovative 3-dimensional platformer where you could explore a huge sandbox environment that even let you manipulate the camera angle. Many Nintendo 64 owners always hoped for a direct sequel to this game, but instead to our ire, we received Mario Sunshine, the least enjoyable 3D Mario game that has ever been created right up until this very day. The flood mechanic was something fans never really wanted, nor asked for, and being made to clean things using this odd third-person shooty weapon was literally an unwanted chore to most. The game alienated Mario fans and was drifting further and further away from everything that made the Mario series so great. If Mario 64 was not your favourite in the previous generation, then it may have been Ocarina of Time or even Majora's Mask, 2 Zelda games that made the perfect jump to the third dimension, giving fans everything they had wanted from the series. People who had transitioned to the GameCube were hoping for another dark gritty Zelda game, but instead were thrown Wind Waker against their wishes, simply because Nintendo did not bend to their consumers' demands. This new art style was met with a lot of rage at the time and alienated long-term Nintendo fans even further, who had grown up with the product, who were expecting something stylistically a little more in line with their own growth. Sure, Wind Waker was a great game, but there is no denying that it did put a lot of people off of Nintendo. Amusingly, the fanbase would get their dark gritty Zelda game in the end on the platform, but it was so late in the platform's life that most had given up all hopes of the GameCube, or had gone on to purchase the Wii instead. Goldeneye was obviously another hugely popular game for Nintendo fans, but sadly a GameCube entry in the series would never materialise. In fact, when it comes to Rare, they would only release one GameCube game, which was Starfox Adventure, yet another terrible sequel to a beloved 64 game that would alienate fans of a franchise yet again. With regards to this, and to Rare's credit, the reason why it ended up a Star Fox game in the first place was simply down to Nintendo's meddling and interference with the development of one of their games. Dinosaur Planet, which was intended to be a Rare IP, was saddled with Star Fox due to the insistence of naughty Miyamoto. In fact, the relationship between Nintendo and Rare during the development of this game would deteriorate so much that it would be the final game they would release on a Nintendo platform, and instead the company would jump to the Microsoft Xbox instead going forward, meaning games in development of the system such as Donkey Kong Racing would no longer see the light of day. The absence of Rare would have been a huge hit for Nintendo. They were the publisher who had pretty much given many people a reason to own a Nintendo 64, and they were now developing games for the Xbox, which did not really bode well for Nintendo 64 owners either, who were looking for similar experiences on the Cube. Speaking of the games, ridiculously, Nintendo would once again cut off their own nose to Spider-Face when it came to their storage media for games. Instead of cartridges, this time Nintendo would opt to use tiny GameCube game discs, which only offered 1.5 gig of space, as opposed to the PS2's DVDs that could hold 4.7 gigs of data, which instantly meant that these discs could hold less than a third of the information a game on the PS2 was capable of. In regards to the PS2, early on its life cycle, it had games that innovated and changed the world, such as GTA 3, the violent cool sandbox game that offered a level of freedom seen like nothing else we had ever witnessed. Quite early on, PS2 owners would also receive Final Fantasy X, the biggest, most immersive Japanese role-playing game the world had ever seen. The game redefined the genre and brought with it an experience that was unforgettable. The graphics alone were amongst some of the most impressive in gaming up until that point. Over on the GameCube, on the other hand, Nintendo were not pioneering the world forward at the same level of which they had done so with the Nintendo 64 in the previous gen, when it came to certain genres of games. As mentioned earlier, these technical marvels appeared to mostly be appearing on the PS2 instead, the system that appeared to be getting everything right. In terms of innovation, the Xbox of that generation would also contribute more to gaming as well. The Xbox would offer an online console gaming experience like none other, and the system's processing power would produce the best console graphics in the world. So that same generation, poor Nintendo had to try and put up a fight against two contenders who were constantly innovating, a trait that Nintendo was supposed to be famous for. Like, in all seriousness, what did the GameCube really bring to the table that propelled gaming forward in any way that generation? Because the only thing I can think of is that bloody handle. Even the Dreamcast took more important steps forward than the Nintendo product, such as offering the same level of graphics years earlier and games like Shenmue, a title that would pioneer the way forward for how many games are experienced now. Literally, the only selling point the GameCube offered was that it would allow consumers to play first-party Nintendo games. Outside of that, there was not a whole lot going on, which the other systems couldn't do better. Speaking of the system's libraries, I cannot deny there are some fantastic games amongst the GameCube's one. Super Smash Bros. Meal, Pikmin, Metroid Prime, Luigi's Mansion, Paper Mario and the Thousand Year Door, just to name a few. There were certainly some great exclusives, just not enough to give it an edge over the system's better equipped competition. During the GameCube's life cycle, it was the first time in history that I owned all 4 big game consoles of the generation during their actual life cycles. Due to the GameCube's failings, I can recall stores in my country such as Dixon's and Curry's, for example, giving up support for the system fairly early on. I could no longer go to these shops and buy Nintendo games, which to me really drummed the failures of this system home. I genuinely thought at the time that Nintendo were going the same way as Sega, as everything I was experiencing was very reminiscent to what had happened when I purchased a Dreamcast a few years before. Nintendo's worldwide support had continued to dwindle throughout my lifetime so far, so it very much looked like the writing was on the wall that the GameCube would serve as the company's final demise in the console arena. It simply did not look like Nintendo could compete head to head with what Sony and Microsoft were doing, and they looked like a dinosaur as a result. Whilst the GameCube was not Nintendo's final home console, in some ways I was still right though. Nintendo would never attempt to go head to head with these companies again by trying to offer a powerful traditional game console. The failure of the GameCube, along with the dwindling support for the Nintendo 64 the previous generation, taught Nintendo some valuable lessons, with that lesson being to never compete with a standard platform ever again. Every Nintendo home console since the GameCube has been heavily gimmick based, as opposed to being similar to the competition, and this is all because of the GameCube's failure. The Wii with its motion controls, the Wii U with its tablet, and the Switch with its dock and handheld mode were all hugely different from the powerful systems Sony and Microsoft have been bringing to the table each generation. So, ladies and gentlemen, I guess those were the reasons the Nintendo GameCube failed, and why we have never seen Nintendo release a traditional games console ever again. Let me know in the comment section if you think I failed to take anything else into account when it comes to the unpopularity of the GameCube. If you're 10 years younger than me, I really hope you are not offended and this video didn't ruin your childhood too much. I am sick of all you millennials throwing your weight around like you rent the place, so thought I would tell you all to get off my lawn that I own. Anyway, enjoy consuming your avocados on toast. Ugh. At this point, if there are not too many tears in your eyes, then I would absolutely appreciate it if you could like, subscribe and hit the notification bell for in-depth videos on gaming history every week. In fact, I usually cover retro consoles rather than these modern Fandango systems like the cubes that have this strange modern media, so maybe you can learn something new by watching those. Yeah. Finally, to conclude, this video on my channel Top Hat Gaming Man is funded by the fantastic support I receive from my amazing Patreon benefactors, who really do relieve an element of stress from my life and help encourage me to get videos out to all of you each week. So a huge thank you and a massive shout out to Carl Johnson, JD Robbins, Sebastian Great, Sim Spacies, Andrew Bizanski, Edward O'Reilly, Quang DX, SpongeMap B, Michael Baker, Computer Man, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins and all of my other patrons. Thank you all very much.